Cutter, what's going on, man?
Oh, not much. Just sitting here reflecting on the heat of the summer that has now come.
Has your first of all, thanks for doing this, man. I really appreciate
Sure.
it.
Yeah, happy to
Has
be here.
your we're kind of coming to the end of COVID. Are you in a post-COVID workflow or life flow yet, or are you kind of still locked in?
Still kind of locked in. My offices will not, because of the campus where I'm at, the different buildings reopened at different times depending on what we could handle. So my office actually doesn't even open till July 1, and only partially. So I'm still sitting in my bedroom as of right now, which has been my home office for the last 15 months, 18 months, however long it's been.
Yeah, you're a associate professor at Fuller and do a lot of things. Can you give us just like a rundown? What is your job? What are you doing at Fuller?
Good question. I often tell people it's kind of like the scene in Toy Story where Buzz first lands in the bedroom in Andy's bedroom, and Rex, the T Rex, comes up and says, "Now, what does a space ranger actually do?" I feel that way a lot being a theologian. People are like, "Wait, what? What do you do? That's a thing."
Yeah.
I teach classes mainly in theology and culture. So what it looks like or means, and how to go about engaging culture as people of faith. And so I teach in those topics on film, television, music, sort of post-secular society, if you will. And then I write and research in that area as well. So a lot of the stuff that I do is kind of in that nexus, even though I'm a movie guy, obviously, Toy
Mhm.
Story. And then it's kind of like another great film, Up, where Doug the dog keeps seeing a squirrel, and I go squirrel. And so depending upon when you came and observed me in my office, you might see me interested in researching and writing and teaching on some topic that just caught my attention that week. So that's generally what I do. But actually, I just graduated with my second PhD in psychology, psychological science. So
I,
my
I had
my
this written down. I was wondering if this is some kind of, fetish or, some kind of
well,
addiction that you
yeah,
have.
it's certainly a pathology.
Is this
Yes.
is this pathology? That's
Yes.
probably the
Yes.
right word to use,
Yeah. Yeah.
not what I used. But I mean, is this just like I'm going to continue to learn my whole life? Is there reasons? Are you done? Are you going to keep going?
yeah. I mean, my wife says I'm done, but
She also said you were
um,
done with tattoos, and I know that's not true. So,
that's true. That's true. Yeah. I mean, I think people that are in my line of work probably skew to being kind of lifelong learners anyway.
yeah.
And so that's not totally abnormal. Most don't go get a second formal degree. I really did it because I was interested in, when I'm talking about the theology of culture, a lot of times, most of the time, actually, what I'm thinking and talking about is how we as humans respond to these various cultural products. So a film, a TV show, whatever. And theologians, as they are wont to do, make up a lot of stuff. And so one of the things that we make up is what we think is happening to people when they watch a movie or read a book or listen to a piece of music. And we not only imagine what they are thinking and feeling and doing, but then we also imagine from there, or generalize from there, what we think God is up to with their activities there in culture. And so part of me was saying, like, well, that's kind of like armchair psychology, really. And if
Mm.
someone who wasn't like a professional theologian was doing that as like theologically and calling themselves like a good scholar, we would be like hub 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 hub, whatever that
Yeah.
noise is that theologians make. So I just thought I really like to develop my skills and my tool set for being able to get at what's actually going on in people's minds and hearts. And so that's why I pursued it, really just to develop my skills. And then I was like, well, I might as well get a degree along the way. So, but this will probably be my last one. Actually, if I did get another degree of some kind, I think it'd be like an MFA in screenwriting or something. So
Mm.
that would be the other thing I would do.
Uh, I've had interesting experiences being married because my wife and I consume media very
Mm-hmm.
differently.
Ah,
She watches stuff with total empathy. She empathizes with the characters. If we watch something that is heart wrenching or dark, or she feels all of that.
Mhm.
I'm looking at the production quality, the lighting,
Yes, yes.
and so like sometimes she'll say like, how can you watch this? It's so dark, or how are you not crying
Yeah.
right now? How do you watch and consume media, and what goes on in your brain while you watch stuff?
You're so heartless. That's the
I
main thing.
am.
Well, so one thing I try to be consistent in my life, which means I try to do the thing that I tell people they should do. Doesn't always work out that way, whether it's with kids or, with students or in the church. But generally, what I try my best to do is, especially when it comes to movies or really kind of any art form, something that's specifically designed as some form of art. Um, the first time I interact with it or engage with it, see it, watch it, listen to it, whatever, I do my best to just experience it, right? Like let it set the terms of engagement, and maybe be a little bit like your wife, right? But part of what C.S. Lewis in his book called Experiment in Criticism, he says this interesting thing that I've always found helpful. And he says the first thing, the first step in sort of critiquing any work, and he's talking about literature in this case, is to look, listen, and receive. Get yourself out of the way. And I find that really helpful because if you go into it always thinking about production. Now, some movies, for example, like you're taken out of the film because the production quality is just terrible. And you're just like, what this? No. And you like, you either unconsciously or consciously reject it and be like, this isn't real. And so, or there's some huge plot hole that's absurd, or something like that. Right. But for the most part, if you can let the story be and let the power of the art form actually affect you, that's at least the first step that I take. Then usually, if it was a really like compelling or moving experience, or even if it was just blah, then I'll come back to it and go, okay, now I need sort of a second round of, well, why did I experience it that way? What was happening? Was I just tired? Was I, did my kids just exhaust me and I'm just in a crying mood? I'm weepy, or was it, really a well done movie? I just watched, at like 5:30 in the morning 2 days ago, this new film called 9 Days that's going to come out later this year. And I was a wreck. I mean, it just wrecked me. And I'm like, wow, what is it? Now where I'm at is I go, okay, wait a minute. I think I actually think it was excellent. And I think I loved it. And I think that's fine. I think I can just full stop say, okay, I enjoyed it and that was worth it. Yeah. But now I'm going back going, were there elements of it that were kind of like heavy handed and sort of grossly sentimental. And the reason that I was so emotional isn't necessarily because it was a great script or an amazing film, but it was just, they were, being manipulative and pulling at my heartstrings. And so I cried, and now I thought it was amazing, and maybe it wasn't. So it's not going to hold up, on repeated viewings. Right. So that's when I get in more into the kind of the film form and the production stuff, is a second and third viewing. And kind of as a way to think through, well, what was going on in that initial thing.
Do you feel like you could pretty accurately depict what is going to resonate with people or not? Or are you still surprised what hits and what doesn't?
That's a good question. Wow, you are good at this. I think I think I can't predict it, but I'm not often surprised. I think maybe that'd be a way to say it. Like, it's if anybody could predict it, well, then all movies would be like huge blockbusters, right? It's really weird how hard it is to know what's going to tap into people's sort of consciousness. And I think part of it is just timing, right? Like when a particular film or something lands, captures the zeitgeist in a way that if it's exact same thing, maybe came out a year or two before, would just land flat. We see that a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really hard to predict. You also don't know all the other kind of like extra filmic things that are going on, like a producer gets canceled or a lead actor is embroiled in a scandal, something like that. So that stuff you can't control. But usually after the fact, if you go, oh, okay, well, these are the films that everyone went and saw. So like F9 just came out, and it's hopefully going to, everyone's thinking it's going to save the theaters. And I haven't seen it, but from what I've heard about it, it's just absurd. And
Of
I'm kind of
course.
like, what,
Yeah.
why? Well, but that's maybe kind of the point. And, it's a bunch of explosions. So yeah, I'm not surprised that
Yeah.
people went and are going to go en masse to see F9. I don't know if I would have been able to predict it. Other things like well, not this movie. There's another movie that I just recently saw that's coming out later this year, called The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Now, this film stars Jessica Chastain and as Tammy
Love
Faye
her.
Baker, and I do too. And
Oh, I saw the preview for this.
and Andrew Garfield as
Yes.
her husband Jim. And I think we need to watch it. I think Christians need to watch it. I think lots of people need to watch it. And in part because I love Jessica Chastain. Fell in
Yes.
love with her in Tree of Life, right? That
And
was
she
when I was
looks
like, oh,
crazy. Like the makeup is crazy.
yeah. And so I can't though tell who that's for,
Right.
because the people that made it, they're people that know who the Bakers are and have some sort of like skin in the game are probably going to be the ones that won't watch it, right? They'll refuse to watch it. And I actually think it's a very sincere take. I don't think they're trying to be ahistorical or make things up. I think it's actually a pretty straightforward take. But then everybody else, like, who's going to watch it? So that movie is a good example of like, man, I don't know who and how it'll resonate.
Yeah.
It resonated with me, but I'm not really sure. So that's maybe a non-answer to your question, but.
No, yeah, it's a little echo chambery. It's going to resonate with the same people who it was going to resonate with before. Do filmmakers need to be, if they actually want to teach something, if they actually want to affect something, do they just need to be a little tricky, hide it?
It is so challenging, I think, because at the core of it, movies at least started as and continue to be entertainment, right? They're supposed to be entertaining, and people go sometimes to be distracted from reality and not think about things. That's why they go see F9, right? You see like a big car swinging like on a bungee cord across the canyon. It's like, what? Right. They're not interested in, and that's what this 9 days is basically a 2-hour long meditation on like the meaning of life given death, right? I mean, right. or the tree of life. It's a same thing. Like this hard to follow non-story with all these beautiful images and like voiceovers where you're going, what? And it's a beautiful piece of art, but you have to commit to it. And I think that's the benefit and the challenge of films. And then like as Christians, you go, well, it's not, I think a part of what our obligation is to develop a kind of ethic of viewership. And what that means is that at times, nothing wrong with being entertained, nothing wrong with going to movies that are fun and silly. But it's also important for us to go and interact with art or any cultural form that actually wasn't designed to entertain us, right? That is actually designed to push us, to press us outside of our comfort zones, that doesn't immediately resonate with us. And that actually is a kind of empathetic gesture that, and I just speaking of like for American Christians, we've become very bad at. So most of the media we consume, we want it to have been made for us by whoever the quote unquote us is, and talking about our concerns, our cares, and couched in a language that we understand immediately. And so we resist and are hesitant toward those things that push us outside of that, or even are just told from a perspective that isn't ours. Right. We struggle on that. And so that's why I think it's actually incumbent upon us to seek those things out, even if in the viewing of it, it doesn't like tap our heartstrings immediately, as I was describing that one film did.
Right. Like how dare Russell Crowe make a Noah movie? Like that sort of, I'm not going to see.
Yes.
Yes. Aronofsky. Is that who directed that?
Yeah. Aronofsky did that one. And that's even a whole nother, so there's one level where it's just like maybe a movie that isn't your style, right? Your genre, you don't get into it. So maybe give it a chance. But then in that case, it's like, okay, this is a story that Christians, interestingly enough, think is their story. Right. And you go, wait a minute, No, actually, we adopted it, or we were more adopted into this narrative line, and we don't own it. We're not the and so now you have a and Aronofsky is like faith adjacent, but otherwise I think would describe himself as a secular Jew. But this is how he was raised. The Noah story was actually his first before it's mine. And so even that of saying like, can I listen to even a story that I claim some sort of obligation to or ownership? Can I listen to someone else tell this story and honor it, respect it? It doesn't mean I have to agree with everything about it, but at least show it the kind of respect it deserves, simply because it's being told from the perspective of another human being.
Yeah, it's the principle of charity, and we're not good at doing that at all in our culture about anything. So why would we apply it to film?
Precisely, especially films about the Bible.
So if, talking about like this whole echo chamber thing, are faith-based films already behind the 8 ball, so to speak, just by calling themselves faith-based films?
I think so. I mean, I was about to ask, what do you mean by faith-based films? But if we're talking about those that say that they are and market themselves as such,
yes,
exactly. I think, it is, well, I could say a lot about this. What do I want to say about this? I don't want to like dog on anybody's efforts of making a movie. I've never myself made a feature-length film. I've made a lot of shorts. I used to be a youth pastor, which means you're essentially a filmmaker. So like cruise ship director. I think those are probably the two things. But I've never made a feature-length film, right? So it's easy for me to sit back and be like, lame, that sucks, whatever. So there are some earnest, sincere efforts out there. So I don't want to paint too broadly. However, if we look at the actual industry, and it is an industry, and it is actually a fairly recent one, the economic model is as follows. We spend no more than $1 million on a film, and we know we're going to make 30 million. And the reason is because we have a network of pretty large churches and then individual Christians out there in the US that will 4-wall theaters and pay tickets as a form of kind of evangelism. And that's going to happen every time we make these movies. And so if right now you came to me and said, Kutter, if you can scrape together $1 million, next week I will give you 29 million back, I would say, yes, please. That's what they're doing. And the sad part is not so much that now that makes for crummy, stories and makes other people think that Christians just make bad art. That is one effect of that, or one byproduct of it. But I think more tragically, a lot of folks see the 4-walling of these movie theaters as a kind of spreading of the gospel. And the stats are very clear. Whenever the people do show up to them, it's Christians who are watching them. And so you get these movies that are about supposedly how, let's talk about the God's Not Dead series, about the power of the gospel, which I believe in. And yet it is literally an echo chamber. It's literally Christian, well, sometimes Christians, mostly Christian producers making Christian stories, selling them to Christians, and Christians watching them and feeling like, and now they'll say, because it was a box office success, quote unquote, we've made our mark in culture, right? Little do we realize, nobody is paying attention to that. People could not care less. The broader sort of society in which we live just couldn't care less how many God's Not Deads we make. And that to me is indicative right now of the films that are called faith-based. It's trying to target this subgroup that will spend money on something they think they want to hear.
I wasn't really planning on going down this rabbit hole, but and maybe we don't have to, but this is something I've been struggling with in terms of faith-based movies, in terms of like, every day on my Instagram or Facebook, I get a notification that some worship band is coming, playing the Forum, or, you're going to sell 1 million copies of something. Like at what point are those industries, Jesus turning over the tables in front of the temple? You know what I mean? Like at what point is some faith-based film production company CEO making millions of dollars off of what you just described, not what Jesus got really angry about, and like the only time he got really angry?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. It might be slightly different with movie. I'm trying to think of the comparison that like, touring worship bands or whatever. That's probably a little closer to like, here's Jesus walking into this place that was designed for worshiping God, right? And these sort of rituals that were designed to help us come into God's presence, then being leveraged for sort of pure economics and radically unjust structures, et cetera. So I think that's right. I don't know if every filmmaker out there who wants to make a faith-based film is thinking that way. I do know that a number are, otherwise earnest sort of investors, and what they'd like to do, they look at film as this medium and they go, wow, millions of people go see movies every day. If we could tell them a gospel story through this medium, wouldn't that be great, right? And it happens that it costs a lot of money. And to do that, we've got to, finance it, et cetera. So there are examples of that. But I do think on the whole and generally, it is what you're getting at. And that is, we're essentially, this is part of why I think people should watch the Tammy Faye thing, especially American evangelicals in the last 40 years. I'll say this. Fuller was even started by a radio evangelist, right? We have American evangelicals, Protestants and evangelicals have a very uneasy relationship with media, and especially like audiovisual media. I mean, they took up in sort of contrast to the British system of television, for example. The US broadcasting strategy was a corporate model instead of a publicly owned model. So the reason you have BBC and all those others is because they said anything on the airwaves should be sort of jointly owned and funded. In America, they said, nope, you gotta advertise. Well, early on, some people, they realized like, we need to have somebody keeping track of the kind of content that goes on here, because this could be bad for like kids and adult, And so early on, there was funding, government funding that paid for a certain amount of hours of religious programming every week. Well, that went to mostly sort of mainline liberal churches. And this is where you get the sort of the Davy and Goliath. I don't know if you ever watched those or seen some of these other things that are kind of like ethical storytelling, but they're not, on the nose, beat you over the head, come and get to know Jesus. Evangelicals, on the other hand, because they didn't get that funding that had to be very broad and sort of plural, both Christians and non, but still virtuous. They had to basically, the only way they could survive was if they raised money while they broadcast their media, right? And so you get this whole economic model that's built out of basically you had no other choice. What is it? Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So televangelism is birthed because of the economic model of American broadcasting, mixed with evangelical sensibility of, we want to leverage media to communicate the gospel. Okay, why does all that matter? It matters because it's this guy, Marshall McLuhan, is famous. Back in the 60s, he wrote a book called The Medium is the Message. And part of what I think we fail to recognize is how, however earnest we may be in communicating the gospel, when we adopt different media, it dictates certain outcomes. And we have to think a little bit more critically about whether or not we are okay with those outcomes. Right now, it's just whatever works, right? And that may not be the most effective way to be a gospel people, right? Is to leverage I'd include social media in that too. Like, we need to think very hard about, is social media, actually, I don't think we need, I'll just right now go on a diatribe. We aren't talking about social media, but we're going to anyway.
Let's go for it.
And that is, social media is working perfectly. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do.
Yes.
And that is to make us angry, bitter people at all those others out there who stand in diametric opposition to me and are threatening the fabric of reality. And I need to, tear them down. It's designed to do that. So for us to think we're going to leverage social media in a way that's going to like generate, constructive conversations or whatever, I think is just well, foolish. I think it's just foolish. Doesn't mean you can't use social media and have fun. I like to tell people about stuff I'm doing. I just did a fundraiser and it was helpful. But we need to think long and hard about these different forms of media, film, television, social media, as Christians, to say, does the actual medium itself in many ways dictate an outcome that we don't want to be a part of? And if so, what is our obligation toward it?
Right. But what's the alternative? Right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm thinking of the alternative to social media, it would, in Christianity, it would be an emphasis on the local church, right?
Yep.
Like that's your community, but there is no emphasis on the local church. Local church is disappearing, just like the mom and pop down the street. And Hillsong has its target, and Hillsong is the new target, and that's disintegrating. So what is the alternative?
Well, I think you're doing it right here is one. So my kind of technological man crush is a guy named Jaron Lanier. And he wrote this book called something like 10 reasons or 10 arguments for why you should delete all your social media accounts right away. Now, what's important of why he's an important person is because he's one of the basically architects of virtual reality and Web 2.0. So he's like one of these early tech guys that was responsible for what we have now. And he, like most of the Silicon Valley folks, they don't have any of their kids on it. They're not on it. Like they're all like, it's like the Manhattan Project. Like we started something that's supposed to be good. But what, and so that's where a good distinction is. It's not all media. It's certain kinds built in certain ways. And so Lanier says actually that he thinks, and I agree with him, that podcasting, for example, is a much better and in fact very sort of potentially life-giving form of media, because it's very hard to like chunk up this conversation between you and I and bite-size it in a way that's spreadable on social media. Now you might want to let people know about this episode through little chunks or whatever, but in terms of the actual medium itself, it opens itself to you and I having a conversation, us kind of going back and forth, inviting listeners into it, because it's a dialogue instead of just this 140 character whatever. And it's way harder to manufacture by a bot, right? Like I'm sure it'd be interesting to know if there are some podcasts out there that are actually bots, but one interesting stat, something like 35% of the quote unquote people you interact with on social media are not humans. They're virtual algorithms. They're not, and you think they're human. So even that, something like this, it's very hard to replicate this kind of conversation. And so I think that's one way we go, but another is, to your point, that at some point, it's not enough to simply bemoan, the church is falling or whatever. It's like, well, then we have to be different. We have to do differently. We have to live life. We have to be in community differently. And that requires something of us that I'll even put myself in that, but like, I'm not always willing to do. And I suffer for it.
Right. I want to get back into faith-based media. And really, I mean, we can just talk about film, because I think it's kind of the same across the board. We talked about how some of them are not great because the budget's not there. It's hard to make a movie for $1 million. But just from a story, from a philosophical standpoint of how they're constructing the stories, I have a hard time finding ones that I vibe with. Do you find that? And then where do they go right and where do they go wrong?
Well, again, we're going to speak in generalities. Typically, good stories or good art is not closed and certain and a sort of, what is it, a monologue, essentially. But usually good art is open and uncertain and invites a dialogue, right? So these are sort of, conversation starters versus conversation enders, if you will. And so it's really hard to to think of these as good art, in part because it has a message, and that message is clear, and it's going to tell you what to think and how to think about it. That is, I mean, that would be my interpretation of a lot of the things that go by faith-based media. So, and it makes some sense because a lot of people imagine the Christian faith or coming to Christian faith as basically coming to a kind of certainty about the world, right? Like you confess to a certain God who did a certain thing, and that leads to a certain sort of way of viewing reality that we talk about putting our faith in, right? Putting our confidence, having, and so when I want to make a movie about that, it has to come out very confidently and certain and clear, right? The bad guy at the end has to go to hell, right?
Right.
Have you seen God's Not Dead?
Oh goodness, no.
Oh, you should watch it.
I did meet Kevin Sorbo though.
Wonderful.
A year ago.
See, and I think Kevin Sorbo is a lovely human, and there's people involved in it that are lovely, and like all this. I'm not even dogging any of the humans involved in it, but the final product, you go, wait, what? And it's this classic like atheist professor who's saved on his deathbed after a lifelong of rejection. And it turns out he's only an atheist because, he was wounded by a Christian before. And the movie sets it up as if, a person's on the way, speaking of worship music, on the way to a Christian concert, and sees Sorbo in the road. And I'm sorry, this is a spoiler alert, but if you're listening now and you haven't seen this,
turn it off.
Turn it off. Or turn it off. And I'm saving you time. But then he's saved, and you go, well, wait, but he's dead. And so just everything that it communicates is so clearly, I think, wrong theologically, wrong apologetically, but very clear. The takeaway is very clear as to what the meaning of faith is, what the meaning of Christianity is. And so the stories that I think are excellent are modeled more off of, shock and awe, Jesus parables. I often wonder, and actually, I got to talk to our lead pastor of our church. I don't know if you talk about our church on your podcast much, do you?
No, it's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I go back and forth because when I preach, and I do sometimes, actually all the time, I walked into my living room earlier today with my daughters, and I said, time for a family lecture. It's time for a family lecture. And my oldest daughter said, wait, what's that? And I'm like, the youngest said, what's that? And I go, this is when you sit here and you listen to something I have to say. That's very important. Anyway, I sort of preach like that sometimes, but I find in my life as a preacher, and I don't preach regularly now. I used to be a weekly preacher or in a role where I had to preach weekly. And I found it was really difficult for me to get in front of a community of believers and read them Jesus' words and then not tell them what they mean, right?
Yeah.
Like I would have to read it and go, okay, I don't think you people are getting what just happened, right? What Jesus just said is crazy scandalous and is crazy challenging and should overturn everything you've ever thought about anything. Right. We've got to respond differently, right? And I would give them, here's what that looks like in our current context. Well, the good of that is it makes me feel better. I'm like, all right, I let them know what I think.
Right.
The bad is I actually don't let Jesus' story land as Jesus told it, right? Like, and I've been noticing our pastor the last few weeks, not this week because it was on hymns, but in previous weeks, more recently, preaching some pretty scandalous messages simply by reading what Jesus is saying.
Dude, literally the last 3 weeks, every week I have gone, you didn't get any emails about this? Like the fact that you haven't gotten any emails, I'm not sure that people are understanding like what we're saying.
Yeah. And
like
that's
when we're talking about like welcoming all people, we're talking about welcoming all people. And I'm not sure when we're talking about what's unclean and I'm not sure people are really fully vibing.
They're not. They're not. Otherwise, they would be sending the emails.
Yes, exactly.
Now, again, I also take comfort in that, Dave has been at our church for a long time. And so it could be that, as he said before, the people that would normally be angered,
they've already left.
They've already left. They're already expected. And
I've not
been tenured as long as Dave at any location. So I'm generally still have the people that are, giving me a shot, but exactly that. And I go back and forth because some people are definitely not going to get it. And so I need to tell them, otherwise, but in truth, that's actually what happened. You even read it in the Gospels that the people didn't get when Jesus did it. And then his closest disciples are coming to be like, wait, what are you talking about, dude? And he's like, you don't even get it. Okay. And then he made, in a few cases. And so, but that's the power of the fact that now what we have inherited are all these stories that are about, birds and planting seeds and, people finding treasure in fields and stuff. And that is the, in my mind, one of the best embodiments of the kingdom of God that we've got.
Yes.
And if that's the model we want to see faith-based films or whatever going, I don't have to come down and do Kutter's preaching and explain it to you. What I have to do is sort of crack open your imagination in a way that here's some theologian babble, but that sort of re-mythologizes the biblical text. So what's the story we've inherited, and how do I reimagine it for you in a way that's generative and that opens up questions and that prompts further thinking from you, doesn't close things down. And that is a challenge because there's a very real chance that not everyone's going to get it, or at least not get it in the way that you think that they should. And that's really hard.
Yeah, I look at faith-based stuff and I vibe with everything that you said. It has to have the perfect outcome. It has to have resolution. And I think from what I see is it's because from a young age, we only tell the stories from the Bible that have that, right? So even when you're super young and it's on the felt board, those stories, we talk about the story of Moses from the perspective of he delivered the people, the Red Sea parted, they all walk through. So then God can do this for you, right? That's the sermon that we hear our whole lives. But we don't also sit with the fact that for 400 years, generations of people died in slavery right before that. Right? What if you're going to have a theology based on the story of Moses, you also have to have a theology of God based on those 400 years. And we just kind of gloss over that and only tell the protagonist kind of superhero stories. And then that's what our media becomes. And it, to the outside culture, it just looks silly.
And, or we tell the story of the hero as if we're the hero.
100%.
When we're probably more the Pharaoh.
And the Good Samaritan. We're always the Samaritan and the Good Samaritan. That was the exact opposite of what Jesus was saying about that story. But we're always so be the Good Samaritan.
So, I mean, we do both. So I think we do exactly what you said. And that is, we're always wrapping it up with the good part, which is legitimately good. I mean, we call Good Friday good because of Easter, right? However, and from more liturgical communities, you would sit in that Good Friday service and intentionally leave it unresolved, right? You walk out of a Good Friday service and you don't remind people about the resurrection because the disciples didn't know the resurrection was coming, right? That's what Good Friday is supposed to be. Or your example of however many hundreds of years in slavery. I actually teach on this a bit in my TV class, and I have been shaped, and this is where, I don't know if we can shift if you want, or we don't have to from faith-based film, but where I find films, media to be deeply and profoundly spiritual, even theological and theologically rich, because they help me, or it gives me categories for thinking about God, about life, about other humans in different ways. So that then I come back to the biblical text and I see it in a new light, right? One example is simply the way that we tell episodic stories in television. You tell an element, a piece of the story without telling the whole story. And I wonder if I want us as Christians to learn how to do that better, to not have to tell the whole story in every telling. That there is some value in leaving it in slavery. There's some value in leaving it when Noah gets drunk and curses his sons. There's value instead. There's value in that. It doesn't mean we want to just be obsessed with the bad stuff. But man, that is what constitutes a huge bulk of our experience. It's what constitutes a bulk of the people of God's experience. And this, whether it's the 9 days or the Tammy Faye thing or F9, it's what contemporary society is making stories about, is the anguish and the pain and the hurt and the loss.
Well, to me, like that's a great example, because that whole story of Noah doesn't make sense until that happens.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if I'm thinking of it like as an analogous story, like that they used to tell to their children, with some kind of lesson, you kind of go, well, it's not in God's nature, and certainly not in God's nature as revealed by Jesus, that he would wipe out all their enemies.
Yeah.
Right. But it is in his nature to be able to say, here's a story. Even if God wiped out all of your enemies, it would be one chapter until you're drunk in a vineyard and your kids leave you to start their own nations. Right.
Yeah.
Like, but since we take out that part of it, then the story becomes a completely different view of God for us and a completely different view of God for the rest of the world. That doesn't make sense anymore.
And it's even back to, one of the things that I teach on is a thing called hermeneutics, right? So it's how you interpret things. So more broadly, how you interpret just life, the meaning of life, et cetera. But then hermeneutics is this discipline that actually started in biblical interpretation. So for a while, it was just known as how do you interpret the Bible. But I think if you're a Christian, if you're a person that was, and not just a Christian, but if you were raised in some sort of religious context, in a Christian context, you were taught certain habits and certain strategies for interpreting the Bible. And usually what happens is you take those methods, those strategies, and you apply them to everything else. So you will see people that interpret, this may be very scandalous, interpret the Bible, the methods they use, this is important, the methods they use, they'll interpret the Bible in the same way they interpret a film, in the same way they interpret the Constitution of the United States. And they use the same strategies and methods. And there's a group, a subculture within American Christianity that interprets it in the way that we were describing before. And that is, you go in, you don't let the story affect you as a story. You go in knowing the outcome and knowing what you already think about it. And you essentially import that prior or that preconceived idea onto the story. And so it's dead on arrival. It's no longer actually a story. It's an illustration.
And that's my biggest gripe, is that it's too freaking big. And so it's really easy to do that. Yeah. Like it's really easy to proof text whatever you want to make it say whatever you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And to do it without, acknowledging the complexities, the other sort of counter stories, and this is why I'm a theologian, because from an early age, I remember going up to pastors going like, wait a minute. Okay, pastor, you just said X in your sermon. What about Y and Z? Not to mention AB3, orange and blue, right?
Right.
This doesn't sit well with, young Kutter. It's just how I've always been wired, but it is part of why I think every Christian could use some theological education because we've been thinking about these things for thousands of years. And it pains me when I, for example, see, we'll get back to those worship leaders leading, concerts, making money. Those same people walk away from the faith. And a lot of times you'll hear their stories. They'll say, well, how is it that if God loves everybody, 1 billion people who are in India every year who've never heard of Jesus, or we think go to hell, or, and then they'll say, nobody's talking about this, and I'm like, wait, what? Yes, we are.
Nobody's talking about it is what gets me every time.
Yes. And I'm like
nobody in your little bubble has been talking about it.
Exactly. And I'm like,
this is hundreds of books written on this stuff.
This is what has constituted the Christian tradition and theology for 2,000 years. Just ink has been spilled all over the place on these things. And so again, it's not that's not a real concern. That's a real concern. What do we do with people who suffer and die never having known the name of Jesus? What does the Christian faith say about that? Okay, we can talk about that. But to leave the faith based upon the fact that you think nobody's talking about it is crazy to me. So that's where I think part of the reason why we need to become more critical consumers of television, of movies, more critical engagers with our own religious authoritative texts, is because we're not. We tend to say, I'm gonna walk into this kind of naive and ignorant, and hopefully God speaks, and whatever God speaks, that's good enough for me, unless what God says, or the pastor says anyway, slightly runs afoul of what I already think, and then I'm upset. And so I think, to your point, the bigness of it, the complexity of it, is something that we need to lean into and train ourselves in, not avoid or become paralyzed with.
Right.
Or be paralyzed by.
What is your theology, I suppose, or how do you view this? Really, it happened for me. It's been well documented on this podcast. It happened to me through Broadway theater, where I started to see these truths that I was just super resonating with. And I would go, oh, well, this writer was Jewish, this writer's an atheist, but this is exactly what I believe. And there's like even biblical backing for these things and all those things. Do you see that as God working in a wider presence? Do you know, what is your kind of theology about how we see these universal truths of God in other places?
Yeah. Well, God's wider presence is a good phrase. I don't know if you're quoting from a book by my theological mentor. Yeah, there you go. You'll
There's
see
the book right there.
if you read the notes in there, you'll see him citing me a handful of times.
It's a good book.
It's
Winter
amazing.
told me about that book.
Yeah. So that's sort of the foundational theological conviction of probably my life, my scholarship, and the stuff that I write and research on. It's also probably the thing that's most critiqued, right, by fellow Christians, theologians, in that at my worst, or when I'm most flippant or unthoughtful, I get it's maybe I go too far. I would rather risk that, though. I mean, that's the risk that I'm willing to take, is to say, well, I thought God was up to something here, but maybe God wasn't. But I'd rather risk it, and the chance that there is something valuable and good and true there, than completely miss it entirely, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it starts from a young age. I mean, I grew up as a CPK, church planners kid. So, I mean, I've been in part of the church for my whole life, and so maybe it's partly just my story that I saw the like dark underbelly of the church, but I never was like anti it. I wasn't ever like, oh, God's not here. But it was very clear to me that I just encountered God in transformative ways more outside of the church than in it. And it doesn't mean that I didn't experience transformation in the church. I did. But there were all these moments, and I'm like, what's happening here? So kind of just intuitively, I just thought, well, why wouldn't that be God? Like what, and then later on, as I kind of continued to probe it, continued to run up against people who did not appreciate me saying things like, maybe Pearl Jam has something to say, or, these sort of things. Then I was like, well, wait, let me stop. Let me think a bit more about this. And that's when I foolishly thought, well, I'll get my first PhD, and then I'll answer it. No, you don't answer your questions by more education. But basically what I've come away with is a kind of a couple sort of takeaways or key points. One is just the sort of a theology of, even a biblical theology of creation. We inhabit an order that pretty clearly biblically, whether it's in Genesis or in Romans or wherever, that the created order reveals God. We encounter God in and through the beauty of nature. We encounter God in and through our own sort of like internal conscience, the sort of prick on our heart of ethics, if you will. We encounter God through the things we make of creation, so the creative products that we make. We encounter God through human relationships. These are real, even if you never utter the name Jesus, right? Now, what's important to say is that doesn't mean Jesus isn't involved in the equation. In fact, the second part on top of creation is to say, I also have to have, again, here's some good theobabble, but a robust pneumatology, right? A really broad sense in which you were saying God's wider presence, but God is present to us in and through the Holy Spirit. It's the Spirit of God who animates everything we do, including our creative projects that breathes life into us and every other living human, meaning that if you are alive, no matter if you're a Christian or not, God is presently active in your life, sustaining your very existence. So for us to say God's not up to something in the lives of non-Christians is not biblical. I mean, it's just fundamentally not biblical. Now, then you get to, okay, well, are they talking, but are they truthful messengers, right? Are they, is the stuff they're saying to be trusted? My first response to that is no, but that goes for me too, right? Like nothing I say should be just trusted at face value. I'm a broken person who's prone to mistakes, and will be self-serving at times. But also there's stuff that I stumble on that's true. And so when it comes to the trustworthiness of others, probably, and this is in Rob's book, God's Wider Presence, I love his take on King Necho, who's a pharaoh from Egypt who meets King Josiah. Do you recall this story either in the Bible? Okay. It's told 2 times, both in Chronicles and Kings. And I don't have my Bible in front of me, so I might mix this up. But in one of the tellings, Josiah dies, and it's not really clear why. I believe in the Chronicles account, King Josiah, who's well known as one of the reforming kings of Israel, right? You get all these bad kings. They're like, they're like idolatrous. They're, sleeping with all sorts of women and wives and marrying foreigners and, so on and so on. Then comes King Josiah and he reforms Israel. He sets up, he demolishes all the idols, all this stuff. And so he's known as this really faithful king of Israel. He discovers the Torah and brings back worship to the temple. And so in terms of Israel's history of good and bad kings, he is top notch. Well, at the end of his life, he gets this message from the Pharaoh from Egypt. Now, remember, this is where Israel came from. They're former enslavers. Nothing good comes from Egypt. So the Pharaoh comes up and says to King Josiah, comes up to the border of Israel and says, I got to get to the other side of your country. I have no gripe with you. I got to go fight these other dudes because Elohim, God, told me to go fight them. Don't come out. It's not going to go well for you, Josiah. And Josiah says basically what every good Christian follower of Yahweh would say is, you don't speak for God. You're the Pharaoh of Egypt. You're a horrible, godless nation. How on earth can you claim to be doing what God wants you to do? No way. So Josiah goes down, meets him prevents him, doesn't want him to go through Israel. They get in a battle, boom, he gets shot by an arrow, and it says he dies. And because, here's what Pharaoh Necho says, Josiah, don't resist me, otherwise you will be, what is the exact language? You will be working against God, basically is what he says. And it shows in the text, he dies because he did not heed, this is the quote, he did not heed the word of God through the mouth of Necho. And I go, that's a pretty damning indictment. And a really interesting picture of how we often posture ourselves toward these other messengers, right? These other mouthpieces of God. Karl Barth famously said that, God could speak through a dead dog if God wanted to, right? And that's pretty pejorative and down. I'm saying it's, Hollywood or whatever are dead dogs, but they are the Egyptian pharaohs in our midst who often are going, I've got this thing, I've got this insight into reality that I really want to share with the world. And for us to go in and say, no, you're all wrong and can't be right, and you can't be trusted, because only we're the insiders. We have the inside track on what God wants and how God speaks and what God says. You don't. We run the risk of actually working against God's purpose, not just sort of like missing something, but actively that's the language he uses, actively opposing God in this instance. And you go, that's one story of numerous where I start going, God really is calling, and this is the story of Israel, right? If you want, you said it was a big story, but here's my sort of summation of the whole thing. The whole biblical narrative is something about the people of God forgetting what it means to be the people of God, and people who are not God's people having to remind them. That's the whole thing, right? Like over and over and over. And so if we're not willing to hear that, and we're not willing to invite that, we are more Israel at the height of its gluttonous worst, whose worship stinks in the nostrils of God. And all the prophets are coming saying, watch out, warning, warning, you know, Will Robinson, danger, danger, you know, and we're saying, no, I'll go get another prophet to tell me what I want to hear, because this one doesn't tell me good things. And that's how I imagine my relationship with media, with film in particular, and why ultimately I tend to not watch faith-based film, because those generally are, you know, the prophet that the king goes and gets after he hears you know, what he doesn't like. So.
Yeah. I mean, I just think of, I've had a lot of conversations with Tim Minchin, who I've had on this podcast, who's become a friend. And, you know, he has a song that he chose not to release in his latest album for numerous reasons, but it's called F That, basically. F This. And it has a lot to do with America and our political system and stuff. But basically the song is F this, F this, F this, F this. But as I sit here on the beach looking out of the ocean, it all fades away. And I feel this insane sense of calm and peace, because he's standing there with his family and they're experiencing this together. Right. And we've all had those experiences, whether it's at the beach, it's in the mountains, where we feel at peace because of, you know, I think it's way cooler to call that the same thing than to call that piece God to me and something else to him. Right. It can't not be the same thing.
I mean, I think a robust theology of God's presence would say exactly that. You don't experience genuine peace outside of God's activity. That no one does. If we have a sort of unitary notion of reality, that God created this and God said it is good, right? Full stop. Yes, it's the whole good but fallen. But whatever good people encounter, if I'm a Christian, now I need to honor and respect them enough, be charitable enough to let them, I'm not going to tell them, oh, you realize you're really just experiencing God. I'm going to let them interpret it, but my interpretation of it is like, oh, wow, I believe that is God. And my obligation, my role is to simply point it out. Not to tell them what to think, but to go like, hey, Tim Minchin, that's interesting. That sounds a lot like the God I worship.
Well, what's really interesting is when we talked about it on my podcast, what we came to the conclusion of is, for me, that's evidence of God. And for him, that's evidence of no God.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
You know what I mean? Like I'm saying, look, it's a God unifying all of us. And he's saying, no, there is no God. It's just the human experience. But like, who cares? We talked about it and had a conversation and both agreed that that was an experience we both loved. Let's celebrate that.
Yes. And that's good. Right. And that's good for you as a Christian. That's exactly what you should be doing, is endorsing what he experienced and celebrating it, without the like expectation that he's going to all of a sudden, you know, become a believer. Right. And because that's not on you, right? That's not on you, Eric, that's on God. But it's also that, we inhabit different interpretive communities. I mean, I think what the Christian faith is a community of interpretation. And what we do is we get around, we circle around this book that we interpret. But we also have this other book called the Book of Nature, right? And we have a different interpretive lens for coming to what does that mean, and part of what it means to be committed to the Christian tradition is I'm committed to that argument about what it means, right? So I'm going to stay connected to you, Eric, and to whomever else that disagrees with me, the callers you're going to get after this, or callers. How old am I? The emailers that you'll get after this. That
first time caller, long time listener, Eric.
That's right. But that's the commitment, right? That at the end of the day, I'm committed to my brothers and sisters. I'm committed to communion with them, no matter what. And I am going to be there, even though I know I disagree with you about what Tim Minchin is experiencing, right? We disagree, but I'm committed to that. And I'm also obligated, because he is made in the image of God and he inhabits and breathes in and out the Spirit of God. I'm committed to love and care for him as well. And so Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That if you're saying theologically you're a Christian, you should have a unitary notion of what's going on. Then there's that second thing of like, okay, now what then do we do with it? And that's far more to me invitational, dialogical, and more just the kind of, pointing out where God shows up in surprising ways.
Well, man, we're going to have to do a part 2 sometimes because I have a lot more that I want to get into, but we're up on the time. These are the conversations. Like, this is why I started this podcast, right? To have these conversations. I absolutely love them. Outside of paying good hard-earned money for a Fuller education, how can people follow along with what you're doing and what you have going on? Is there any way?
There is actually, just to, toot my own horn for a little bit. I'm actually relaunching the Kutter Callaway podcast this fall. So new episodes, we're going to call it In Real Life, and I'm co-hosting it with a colleague of mine, Jasmine White. And we're actually kind of relevant to our conversation today. It'll be, the center point will be something like film and TV. So we're going to start with those, and then from there kind of dive into, okay, how does that matter in real life as a parent, as a pastor, as a human, as a friend, and so look for that. That'll come out this fall. And it'll be me talking like this, but about specific film and TV that's coming up.
With guests?
Yeah, with guests. So our first one was with, the first episode we recorded, and it might be, I don't know if it'll be the first one out. I was hoping to get Questlove. We didn't, but it was on his Summer of Soul documentary that just came out. Yeah. And so we interviewed the leads for The Fifth Dimension, who are some of the singers. I don't know if you remember the Age of Aquarius and others.
Totally, yeah.
That were there. So we interviewed them. They turned out, I didn't know this, they're Christians. And so we talked about gospel music and the 1960s and all that stuff. So they were our first guests.
We might have to talk about that. All right.
Yeah, we should. But the next one, hopefully, I'm actually hoping we'll get Jessica Chastain or Andrew Garfield to talk about the Tammy Faye one. And then possibly my other hope is we'll land Tony Hale, who was in this 9 Days as well. So those will be some of the first.
He has a new Disney Plus show.
Yes, I've heard about this. I got to go watch that
too. Fantastic.
Yes, the guy I ride bikes with was just telling me about that.
The first 2 episodes are phenomenal.
What's it called again?
The Mysterious Benedict Society.
Right. It's on Disney.
It is
Plus.
phenomenal.
I've
it's
heard
him
great
and
things.
Kristen Schaal, and it is awesome.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm gonna go check that out. Man. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much for doing this, man.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you, and we'll have to do it again.
Awesome. Thanks a bunch.